contrast is the use of opposing elements like color, opposite kinds of colors, or really, really different colors, or opposing shapes, or lines, or types of lines in proximity, so close to each other within the painting, to produce an intensified effect on the work of art. So they produce an intense effect. So if we look at this painting that I have up here for you, this is a still life by the artist Paul Cézanne. We spent a lot of time last year talking about Paul Cézanne and his work, but because Paul Cézanne uses so many different kinds of contrast in this painting up here, we can really, some things really stand out. So the apples, for example, that are all piled up on the table, and the pitcher, and the cloths, some of them really pop out for us visually, so that we have a nice focal point. Our eye knows exactly where to look. If everything in this composition were painted with the same level of color intensity, for example, our eye wouldn't know where to look. It would all look kind of flat and dull. So there are lots of different kinds of contrast happening. There's light value versus dark value. There is hard edge versus soft edge. Okay? There's color temperature. So there's warm color versus cool color. There's pattern versus no pattern. So there are lots and lots of contrasting elements here that are making this really cool to look at and interesting. Let's look at a couple other really good examples of contrast. So if you look over here at this black and white composition, there's value contrast between the darks and the lights. They're really, really, really dark values next to really, really light values. So our eye knows where to look, and it's more interesting. If everything in this composition were painted the same value, it would be really, really boring, and it would all just look like fuzzy grays, right? Also, there are some really, really hard edges in here, and then there are some that are a little bit fuzzier, right? So that contrast is really important. So we're going to practice a few different ways to create it by making something called just a little contrast chart. I'm going to do watercolor today. I'm going to recommend that you use watercolor for this project, and here's why. Watercolor is incredibly forgiving, and if you're one of those people that tends to get really, really meticulous with your painting and really like tight with your painting and obsessive, watercolor will help you loosen up a lot. And it's easier to get it done quickly, believe it or not, because you can do washes of color. It's also really, really forgiving because you can go back in and reactivate the paint. So you don't have to use watercolor. You can use acrylic, and you can use all of these techniques with acrylic, but I want to strongly encourage you to think about watercolor, so that's what I'm going to show you right now. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is using intense color versus neutralized color. These colors are really, really vibrant, bright colors. You're thinking lots and lots of paint, hardly any water. It's almost like straight out of the tube, okay? If you want your vehicle to be really intense, then you don't want the background to also be really intense. You want the background to be softer and more, it's called neutralized, and there are three main ways to create that effect. One is by creating a wash. So you take that same color and you dilute it with a lot of water, and you get what's called a wash. Now you could flip that, and you could decide to paint your vehicle with a wash, and you could decide to make the background really intense. That could be really cool too, I don't know. Another thing that you can do is create a tone. So we kind of learned about this last week, where you take that color and you mix it with a gray. Who remembers how to mix a gray? What are the two colors we need? Shout it out for us.
Black and white.
Black and white. So I'm going to mix up a gray. Notice I'm really washing my brush in between colors. I'm going to create a nice gray to make a tone of this blue. So now look at that. It's really soft. Imagine how cool that would be as a background color for your car if your car was a really, really intense blue. That would be really beautiful. okay? Another way that you can neutralize that color is by mixing in a little bit of the color that's opposite your vehicle's color on the color wheel. So who remembers what color is opposite blue on the color wheel? Directly across. Orange. Yes. So I'm going to mix a little bit of an orange here. And I'm going to show you what happens and how that neutralizes my blue. So now that's called complement, using a complementary color. So now I have a whole other neutralized color I can do. So another way to create contrast is to go dark values versus light values. That's kind of a no-brainer, right? So when we talk about dark values, sometimes that means we're talking about shades. Shades. So maybe I want my car to be a midnight, it's going to be like a midnight blue. Here's my midnight blue. That's really inky. Okay? And then I might contrast that with a light value in my background. So then maybe it doesn't have to be the same color, but just, to show you. But then I may use a tint or vice versa. Maybe I want the setting of my car to be in nighttime. That could be really cool. All right. Now let's talk about texture versus non-texture, because that's a whole other thing that you can do. So say my vehicle is going to be really it's going to be non-textured and kind of dark. And I want to create the illusion that in the background there are trees and bushes and stuff, but I don't want to paint all that because that would be really time consuming and maybe I don't have time to do all that. So instead, oops, I flipped these. So instead, I'm going to create the illusion of the textures of trees and things in the background by doing a couple things to my paint. So one of the things that I can do is I can put salt. I can sprinkle a little bit of salt into my paint. Now this only works for watercolor, but it creates this kind of an effect, okay, which is really cool. Another thing that I can do is to create texture with either watercolor or acrylic, but the paint has to be really wet, is I can crumple up a paper towel and press it in there, and I can create textures that way too. Now, here's where acrylic is kind of a disadvantage, because once your paint dries and you're using acrylic, there's nothing else you can do to that paint. You can't really go in there and do anything. But when you're working with watercolor, you can actually, this paint is totally dry, it's from 2 hours ago. I can get that paint wet and totally reactivate it, and I can do stuff to it, okay? So maybe I want to sprinkle a little salt in there, now I can because it's wet. If that were acrylic, there wouldn't be much I could do to that, okay? Now last but not least, let's talk about soft edges versus hard edges, okay? So if you took art as a 6th grader, we did a lot of work with watercolor, and we did a lot of the soft edge. So a soft edge is when you do what's called an intentional bleed with your watercolor paint. And it's really cool. It's a cool way to create an effect of motion in the background. So if you want to make it look like the car or vehicle is like whizzing by or, whatever, you can do what's called an intentional bleed, which is where you take wet paint and into that paint you dab more wet paint and you let it bleed. Okay? Yes, you dab. Okay? So you can do it in directions. There are lots of different things you can do. It's only going to go where the wet paint is, though. Notice how it stops down here because the paper's dry. Okay? Now, here's where watercolor is tricky. Where watercolor is tricky is that if you put wet paint next to wet paint, it will bleed out for you, and you don't always want that. So, for example, when you're painting your vehicle, you want hard edges. So in order to maintain hard edges, you're going to have to be patient and let paint dry. So say this is the hood of my car right here. I want that edge to be really, really crisp. I'm going to have to wait to paint this area until the paint has dried or it will bleed, okay? And it will look like this. So I don't really want, if I'm going for a hard edge, I've got to be patient. So that's the only disadvantage to watercolor, okay? But that's a whole other way to create contrast.